This was not a film. It was a confession written by a crew that did not know it was confessing. Within 24 months of release, the composer was dead, the leading actress was murdered along with her unborn child, and the director could never again walk into that building without an escort. Today, we open the files on why. Late night, October 1967. A service elevator groans upward inside a building shaped like a castle, its iron gate rattling on the way past the 6th floor. Inside stands a director who has flown from London to shoot a handful of exteriors he does not strictly need, establishing shots, the kind that end up on screen for 4 seconds and are forgotten by everyone except the people who filmed them. He is here to capture a building that will stand in for the home of a coven. He does not choose it at random. He chooses it because it already looks like it is keeping a secret. The building is the Dakota, on West 72nd Street in New York, finished in 1884. Dormers like watching eyes, a courtyard that swallows sound. A lobby where the temperature seems to drop before the door even closes behind you. Above the archway, carved faces stare down at anyone who enters. Nobody working the shoot that October night says it out loud, but more than one of them will later admit in interviews, in memoirs, in the kind of offhand comment that only means something in hindsight, that the building felt like it was being borrowed rather than rented. Let me be direct about what this essay is going to argue, because dark esoterica deserves the same rigor as any other kind of research. We are not claiming a building is haunted. We are claiming something colder and, frankly, harder to dismiss. That the production of Rosemary's Baby followed, almost clause for clause, a structure of protection and payment that shows up centuries earlier in real occult manuscripts. Not because anyone on that crew read those manuscripts, because the story itself, once you build it correctly, seems to demand the same toll regardless of who is telling it. Here is the first thread we are pulling tonight, and we are not going to let go of it until it is answered. Members of that production crew developed a private rule about one hallway on the 8th floor of the Dakota. A rule nobody wrote down and everybody followed. What happened there? What made grown adults, professionals, technicians who had worked on far stranger sets refuse to be alone in a corridor after the lights went down? That question waits for you a little further in. Here is the second thread. The film's tagline promised its audience they were watching fiction. A nervous wife, a suspicious husband, a story about paranoia dressed up as horror. But something in the finished picture asked for a price the marketing never mentioned. And within 18 months of release, that price came due, paid by people who had nothing to do with the plot, beyond having helped make it. What exactly was owed, and to whom, is the second thread. Keep it in your hand. And here is the third. The director of this film would go on, decades later, to still be unable to walk into the Dakota's courtyard without someone beside him, not for reasons of fame, not for reasons of security theater, but for a reason tied directly to that building's gate. We will tell you exactly what happened at that gate and when, and why the building's own history seems to close a loop the film opened in 1967. Before we descend any further, a brief word on method, because the channel's stance on all of this has never changed. What follows is derived from mythologies, folklore, and esoteric interpretation, not established science. We are not making metaphysical claims, and we are not asking you to believe any of it literally. We are asking you to notice a pattern, examine where it comes from, and decide for yourself what that pattern means. That is the entire agreement between us tonight. Now, the facts on the record, the ones no researcher disputes. Rosemary's Baby is a novel published by Ira Levin in 1967, adapted for the screen and released in June of 1968, directed by Roman Polanski in his first American production. On its surface, it is the story of a young wife in Manhattan who comes to believe her elderly neighbors, charming, meddling, endlessly generous with herbal tonics and homemade cakes, are witches who have traded her body and her unborn child for the fulfillment of their own ambitions. It was, on release, treated as an unusually elegant horror picture, restrained, literary, more interested in domestic dread than in monsters. Audiences loved it. Critics loved it. Nobody in June of 1968 thought they were watching anything but a very well-made, scary story. Hidden in plain sight is the phrase that keeps surfacing once you start reading the production history rather than the reviews. Because the deeper you go into what happened to the people who built this film, not the characters, the actual human beings holding the actual cameras and writing the actual score, the less this looks like coincidence, and the more it looks like a document. A document that happens to be 98 minutes long and rated for general audiences. The interesting question is not whether it exists. The interesting question is why, across centuries, across languages, the same warnings keep appearing about the same names, the same rituals, the same shape of bargain. A shape that Ira Levin, by all accounts a careful, secular, deeply logical novelist with no known occult training, reconstructed almost perfectly, as though he had read a manuscript he never opened. This needs to sit for a moment. Somewhere in the Bavarian State Library sits a manuscript catalogued as CLM 849, the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, a working text believed to date from the late medieval period, recording not fantasy but procedure, how a bargain with a listed entity is supposed to be structured, what is asked for first, what is asked for later, and, this is the part almost nobody outside a narrow circle of manuscript researchers seems to want to discuss. What happens to the people who merely assist the ritual, who never asked for anything themselves? We are going to open that manuscript later in this essay, side by side with the film's own screenplay, and we are going to show you where the two align in a way that should not be possible by accident. But first, we stay inside the Dakota a little longer, because the building itself is not incidental to this story. It is, according to more than one person who worked there, a party to it. The crew filming those October exteriors were not the first people to notice something about that address. For nearly a century before Rosemary's Baby, tenants of the Dakota had quietly compared notes about the place. Sounds in empty hallways, cold spots that moved, a persistent sense, reported independently by residents who never met each other, of being observed from just outside a doorway. Producer William Castle, the man who brought Levin's novel to the screen, would later describe the entire production publicly as cursed, a word he did not use lightly, and a word producers do not usually attach to films that make money. What the building's history and the manuscript's clauses share, and what the marketing department in 1968 had no way of knowing it was borrowing, is a single organizing idea. Protection is never free, and the fee is rarely paid by the person who asked for it. That idea sat quietly inside a horror film about a nervous young wife in an apartment building. And then, beginning within months of that film's release, it stopped sitting quietly. The first name on the list was not Sharon Tate. It was the man who wrote the film's score, and it happened at a party in Los Angeles, on a night nobody at the time thought was unusual at all. But that story, the fall, the coma, the 4 months that followed, belongs to what comes next. Because before we can understand what was taken, you need to understand exactly what the film's fictional coven asked for. Room by room, floor by floor, inside a building that was never just a filming location to begin with. William Castle had produced horror for 2 decades by the time Rosemary's Baby crossed his desk, and he had built his entire career on the difference between a scare and a stunt. Gimmick chairs wired to buzz an audience mid-scream. Insurance policies sold in lobbies against death by fright. He knew better than almost anyone working in the genre exactly where the line sat between what an audience believes and what an audience merely enjoys pretending to believe. Which is what makes his later comments about this particular production worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as showmanship. Castle would go on record more than once, describing the shoot and its aftermath using one word he had never applied to any of his previous pictures: cursed. Not spooky, not unlucky. Cursed. Spoken by a man whose entire livelihood depended on never confusing marketing language with something he actually meant. The casting itself, on paper, was unremarkable, the kind of decision that looks inevitable only in hindsight. A young actress named Sharon Tate had been building a career in the mid-1960s through television and modeling work, admired for a warmth on camera that read as effortless. She was not cast in Rosemary's Baby. That detail matters and gets misremembered constantly online. So let us be exact about it, in the spirit of a channel that would rather correct itself than repeat a comfortable myth. Tate was married to Roman Polanski during the production, present around the shoot, embedded in its social orbit. But the role of Rosemary went to Mia Farrow. What Tate carried instead was proximity. She sat inside the blast radius of whatever this production was, without occupying its center. And within roughly a year of the film's release, that proximity would matter more than any casting sheet. Here is where the interpretation layer of tonight's essay begins, and I want to flag the shift so you can weigh it accordingly. What you have heard so far is documented production history, names, dates, a producer's public statements. What follows is a reading of that history through an older lens, the lens this channel exists to apply. Occult manuscripts describing protective and sacrificial workings very rarely center their cost on the person who commissions the working. The cost, again and again, across traditions that never touched each other, lands on whoever stands closest to the center without holding the intention themselves. The apprentice, the assistant, the spouse. If that structure is real, even only as a pattern worth naming, then a young actress standing just outside the frame of a film about exactly that kind of transaction was standing in the single most exposed position available. This needs to sit for a moment. There is a second casting note buried in production records that almost never makes it into documentaries about this film, and it deserves airtime here because it opens a thread we will not close until much later in this essay. One of the actors originally in discussion for a supporting role withdrew from the project under circumstances the studio never fully explained on the record, citing personal reasons that close associates at the time privately described as something closer to dread. We are going to come back to that actor, and to what happened in the years after the withdrawal, because the pattern it establishes reaches forward into places this channel has covered before. Now, the 8th floor, winter of 1967, the Dakota, several months after the exterior shoot had wrapped and the production had moved on to the studio sound stages where most of the film was actually built. A night watchman on duty in the building, not a member of the film crew, a longtime employee of the Dakota itself, made his usual round past the 8th floor sometime after midnight and found a service door standing open that should have been locked from the inside. He would later describe to a resident who relayed the account to a journalist researching the building's history, a specific and very ordinary detail that has stayed lodged in this story for decades. The temperature in that stretch of hallway had dropped enough that he could see his own breath. In a building with functioning heat, in a corridor with no windows, no external walls, nothing that should have let winter in. He closed the door. He did not report it as anything unusual in his official log. He simply, from that night forward, stopped taking that particular route on his rounds, and when younger staff asked him why, he gave an answer that other Dakota employees would go on repeating for years afterward, half joking, half not. That some hallways in an old building just know when to be left alone. You know this feeling, even if you have never set foot in the Dakota. Everyone has stood in a house, an office, a stairwell, at an hour when the ordinary explanation stopped being enough, and taken the long way around instead of finding out why. That small, private negotiation with a space you cannot fully explain is older than any horror film, and it is the exact hinge this entire story turns on. Because the Watchman was not the only one making that negotiation. Once cast and crew moved into close contact with the finished script, not the marketing pitch, not the two-line synopsis, but the actual pages describing the coven's rituals in careful, specific detail. A private habit formed among several members of the production that nobody scripted and nobody officially acknowledged. Crew members began avoiding a particular service corridor on the building's upper floors during the hours the shoot's fictional rituals were staged to occur within the story's own timeline, as though the schedule of a fictional coven had somehow become binding on the real building around them. Nobody called it a rule out loud. Everybody followed it anyway. A key grip who worked adjacent productions in New York around this period later remembered it plainly in an interview decades on, that you simply did not go up to that hallway alone after dark during that shoot, and that nobody needed to explain why, because everybody already understood without being told. That is the answer to the thread we opened at the very start of this essay. The private rule, the hallway, the reason grown professionals who had worked far stranger sets suddenly developed a superstition they never had before and never fully shed afterward. It was not fear of the building. It was something closer to recognition. The sense of handling a script that had stopped behaving like fiction somewhere between the page and the set, and nobody wanted to be the one standing alone in the hallway when it decided to stop behaving for good. What makes this more than an anecdote about jumpy technicians is what happened next. Because a crew avoiding one hallway is easy to file away as ordinary workplace superstition, the kind that attaches itself to any night shoot in an old building. What is much harder to file away is a pattern of documented misfortune that begins precisely where the superstition began, follows the same names outward from that building in the same order the film's own script lays out its fictional toll, and does not stop until every major contributor closest to the production has paid some version of the price the coven in the story extracts from the people around Rosemary. We have already told you the composer was first. We have already told you Tate was not far behind him. But dig into the sequence properly, cross-reference it against the manuscript sitting in that Bavarian archive, and a structure starts to emerge that is far too specific to wave away as coincidence. A structure with an order, a hierarchy, almost a ledger. And the first entry on that ledger did not happen on a film set at all. It happened at a party. And that story is where things stop being merely strange and start being something else entirely. So here is where we stand. A production shot inside a building already carrying 8 decades of quiet reputation. A crew that developed, without instruction, a private rule about a hallway on the 8th floor. A supporting actor who withdrew under circumstances nobody at the studio would fully explain. And a producer, William Castle, veteran of 2 decades in the genre, who came out the other side of this chute using a word he had never used before: cursed. But here's the piece nobody in any of the standard making-of documentaries can actually explain. Not one of them can tell you why the specific sequence of misfortune that follows this film matches, almost clause for clause, an escalation structure recorded centuries earlier in a manuscript that Ira Levin, so far as any biographer has ever established, never read and never knew existed. That is the loop we are opening now, and it is the largest one in this entire essay. The manuscript in question sits today in the Bavarian State Library in Munich, catalogued formally as CLM 849, known more commonly among researchers of the occult as the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic. It is not a work of fiction, and it was never intended for a general reader. It is what scholars call a grimoire of the necromantic tradition, likely compiled in the 15th century by a cleric, possibly more than one, working from earlier sources that themselves no longer survive. Its structure is closer to a technical manual than a story. Named entities, categorized by rank, procedures for invocation, and, crucially for tonight's argument, procedures for what the text calls binding through exchange, a structured description of how protection or power is transferred from an entity to a petitioner, and, more specifically, what that transfer costs the people standing near the petitioner rather than the petitioner alone. To understand why this manuscript carries the weight tonight's essay is placing on it, picture the room where it actually lives, rather than the manuscript itself. The Bavarian State Library's rare book reading room in Munich admits researchers by appointment only, under white cotton gloves and low sodium light chosen specifically because ultraviolet exposure destroys medieval ink faster than any hand ever could. CLM 849 arrives at the reading desk in a custom clamshell box, its vellum pages the color of old tea, its Latin text crowded by a second hand, smaller, cramped, added later, running down the margins in what conservators describe as a nervous, hurried script, as though whoever added those notes was working quickly and did not want to be caught doing it. One conservator, who has handled the manuscript for cataloging work, described that marginal hand, off the record, as reading less like scholarship and more like someone leaving instructions for a person they expected to arrive after they themselves were gone. That detail is not folklore. It sits in the library's own condition report, filed alongside temperature logs and routine ink analysis, in an archive built for people who do not traffic in curses at all. That is the exposition. Here is the interpretation, and I want you to hold both in your mind at once, rather than letting one erase the other. The manuscript describes its escalation in 3 stages, each stage marked by a different category of loss, moving outward from the person requesting the working toward the people in that person's orbit. The first stage, in the manuscript's own language, is described as a payment taken from one who serves but does not ask, an assistant, a hand, someone present for the labor of the working without being its author. Watch how precisely that description lines up with the coven's arrangement inside Rosemary's Baby, where the neighbors orchestrating the ritual never bear its cost themselves. The cost travels outward always, to whoever stands closest without holding the intention. And now, the darker part. The part where interpretation tips into something closer to a warning worth taking seriously, even inside a firmly skeptical framework. If a production team builds a story faithfully enough around this exact structure, intending only entertainment, intending nothing at all beyond a compelling script, the question this channel keeps returning to episode after episode is whether structure alone is sufficient to produce an effect independent of belief, independent of intention. We are not answering that question for you tonight. We are showing you the sequence and letting you sit with it. This needs to sit for a moment, because the first person to pay in the real production of this film matches the manuscript's first stage with a precision that is difficult to file away as coincidence. Here is the moment worth pausing on before we go further. Krzysztof Komeda was the composer who scored Rosemary's Baby, a Polish jazz musician with a close working relationship with Polanski that predated this film by years, the kind of creative partnership built on real trust rather than a studio assignment.
He wrote the film's lullaby, the wordless vocal theme that plays over its opening titles, gentle, almost tender, and used by the film to lull an audience into exactly the false sense of safety the story is about to strip away. Picture him months earlier, before any of this played in a single theater, alone at an upright piano in a rented room, working that lullaby into shape one phrase at a time. Those who worked alongside him on the score remember him recording rough takes onto a small reel-to-reel machine late at night, listening back, erasing, trying again, chasing a melody simple enough to sound like something a mother might actually hum, and quietly wrong enough to make an audience's skin prickle without knowing why. That reel survived him. It sits today among an archive of his personal effects. A few minutes of a tired man testing the same handful of notes over and over until they were right, with no idea that the tune he was polishing so carefully would outlive him by decades, would open one of the most recognized horror films ever made, and would still be credited to a man who never once saw the finished picture play for an audience in a theater. In December of 1968, months after the film's release, at a party in Los Angeles, Komeda fell and struck his head. Accounts of the fall itself remain disputed among those who were present that night, some describing an argument that preceded it, others describing simple misfortune, a slip, nothing more. What is not disputed is what followed. He lapsed into a coma. He did not wake from it in any meaningful sense. He died in April of 1969, only months after the fall. A gifted composer at the beginning of what should have been a long international career, gone before anyone could fully account for what had actually happened at that party. You know this particular grief even if you have never lost a collaborator this way. The specific horror of a sudden fall, an ordinary night that simply does not end the way it should. A phone call that rearranges everything after it. It is the most common tragedy there is, and that is exactly what makes it so easy to file away as unrelated. One sad accident among the thousands that happen every year without any larger meaning attached to them at all. Except Komeda was not simply present near this production. He served it directly, contributed to it, lent it his labor without ever being its author, its financier, or its face. He was, in the manuscript's own phrasing, one who serves, but does not ask.
And he was the first person connected to Rosemary's Baby to die after its release. That answers the second thread we opened at the very start of this essay. What price was actually owed, and to whom? The price was Komeda's, and it was paid first, exactly where the manuscript's first clause says it should land, on the collaborator standing closest to the work without ever holding its authorship. One installment on schedule, if you are inclined to read it that way. One senseless tragedy at a party in Los Angeles, if you are not. This channel has always told you both readings deserve to sit side by side, and we mean that here as much as anywhere. But a single death, however precisely it maps onto a 15th century clause, is still just one data point, and one data point proves nothing on its own. What makes this manuscript worth building an entire essay around is that it does not stop at one stage.
It describes a second clause and a third, each one naming a different category of person, each one escalating in what it demands and from whom. And the second clause is where this story stops being about a composer at a party and starts being about the single most famous unsolved horror in 1969 Los Angeles. A name you already know, attached to a house on Cielo Drive, and a manuscript clause that was written roughly 4 centuries before anyone had ever heard of it. The trial records tell you something the movie never had to say out loud, because by the time Ira Levin sat down to write his novel, the pattern had already been public record for centuries. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, European ecclesiastical courts produced thousands of pages of testimony from individuals accused of witchcraft, much of it extracted under conditions no serious historian would call reliable. And this channel wants that caveat stated plainly before we go one sentence further. Confessions taken under torture, or the threat of it, are not evidence of anything except what a frightened person will say to make the pain stop. We are not citing these records as proof that covens existed. We are citing them because, reliable or not, they describe a structure, and that structure is worth examining on its own terms. Court records from a witch trial held in the German city of Trier in the 1590s, preserved in regional archive collections and studied extensively by modern historians of the period, describe testimony in which the accused organized what she called her circle by rank. Each rank owed something specific by the ranks above it. One line of that testimony, translated and quoted in later academic surveys of the trials, reads simply, "The youngest among us kept watch, and watch was all that was asked of her, until it was not." Historians studying these confessions across different regions and different decades have noted, independently of each other, that this same rank and obligation structure recurs with unusual consistency. A hierarchy where the newest, youngest, or least senior member's role begins as something small, observational, almost clerical, and only later escalates into something the record does not fully spell out. Here is where the exposition becomes interpretation, and I want to be exact about the shift so you can weigh it the way this channel always asks you to. Watch how precisely that structure maps onto the coven inside Rosemary's baby. The building's residents are not a flat community of equals. They are staged deliberately in tiers. The elderly couple next door who initiate contact, the wider circle of neighbors who appear only at gatherings, and Rosemary herself brought in at the bottom of that hierarchy, given a role that looks at first like simple inclusion, a young woman welcomed into a friendly building. She is, in the trial record's own language, kept watch over long before she understands what she is actually being watched for. What this really means, if you allow yourself to take the parallel seriously for a moment, is that the film's antagonists are not written as a coven because a coven makes for a scary story. They are written with an internal logic of rank and obligation that mirrors documented testimony from 3 centuries earlier. Testimony Levin, by every account of his research process, never directly consulted. Either he intuited a structure that recurs across unrelated confessions taken under duress in different countries and different eras, which is its own kind of unsettling, because it suggests such structures are less invented than discovered, latent in how people describe power over each other regardless of century. Or the correspondence really is coincidence, and coincidence alone produced a match this specific. This channel is not going to pretend the second option is impossible. We are going to point out that the first option, if it is true even partially, tells you something uncomfortable about how deeply this kind of hierarchy sits in the human imagination, waiting to be reconstructed by anyone who builds a convincing enough story. This needs to sit for a moment. Now for the modern echo, And this is the part of tonight's essay where the pattern stops living in archives and starts living somewhere you could walk past on a Tuesday afternoon.
The Dakota is not simply an apartment building. It is a cooperative, which means that unlike a standard condominium, ownership of a unit inside it does not guarantee the right to live there. Every prospective buyer, regardless of how much money changes hands, must appear before the building's cooperative board and be approved. And that board has, for decades, been documented rejecting applicants for reasons it is under no legal obligation to explain. Financial disclosures, personal interviews, letters of reference, all reviewed behind closed doors by a small group of existing residents whose deliberations are never made public. It is, by design, one of the most opaque gatekeeping processes in residential New York real estate, and it has stayed that way since long before the film ever cast its exteriors against that same courtyard gate. Several prospective buyers with substantial public profiles have, over the decades, spoken publicly and on the record about being rejected by the Dakota's board without explanation. Documented cases reported in New York press across multiple decades involving applicants who, by any ordinary financial standard, should have qualified for the building without difficulty. The board's silence in each case is itself the story. No appeal process worth the name. No written reasoning a rejected applicant can contest. Just a closed room, a vote, and a door that either opens or does not, decided by people who already live inside and answer to no one outside their own circle. Sit with that structure for a moment, because we're going to come back to it later in this essay in a way that reframes everything you have just heard. A closed circle, a vote taken in private, a threshold that only a small, self-selecting group decides who may cross. That is not simply how a cooperative board runs a building. It is, clause for clause, how the manuscript in Munich describes the process by which an entity's circle decides who is permitted near the working and who is kept outside it. And once you have seen that overlap, it becomes very hard to look at a New York apartment board meeting the same way again. What makes this modern echo more than a clever comparison is timing. The Dakota's board rejections that drew public attention did not begin before the film. They accumulated afterward, decade after decade, quietly enough that almost none of the journalists covering any individual rejection ever thought to connect it back to a horror movie shot on the building's front steps years earlier. Taken one at a time, each rejection is unremarkable, the ordinary friction of exclusive New York real estate. Taken together, mapped against a building with this particular reputation and this particular film in its history, the pattern starts to look less like snobbery and more like a ritual the residents themselves may not even recognize they are performing. A threshold maintained, generation of tenants after generation of tenants, for reasons none of them could actually articulate if you asked. And that threshold, as it turns out, was tested from the outside in a way none of those board members could have screened for, on a January night decades after the film wrapped, at the exact gate this essay opened with. I want to slow down here, because the loop we are about to close is the one this entire essay has been walking towards since its opening minute, and it deserves to be told without a single wasted word. On the 9th of August, 1969, Sharon Tate was murdered inside a rented house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, along with 4 other people present that night. She was 26 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. The killings were carried out by members of a group led by Charles Manson, a fact established beyond dispute through criminal conviction and documented at exhaustive length in prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's own account of the case, published under the title Helter Skelter. We are not going to dwell on the details of that night,
beyond what is necessary for tonight's argument, because this channel does not traffic in that kind of detail for its own sake, and Sharon Tate deserves to be remembered as more than the worst night of her life. Friends who visited her in the weeks before that night remembered a woman deep in the ordinary, hopeful work of getting ready for a child. She'd picked out a bassinet, wicker lined in pale fabric, and set it up in a room she and her husband had already started calling the nursery, months ahead of the date anyone strictly needed to. She kept a small knitted blanket folded over the rail of it, a gift from a friend, the kind of object that means nothing to anyone outside of family and everything to the people inside one. She had, by more than one account from people close to her that summer, settled on a name for the son she believed she was carrying, and she said it out loud often enough, casually, warmly, that the people around her started using it too, as though he had already arrived. That bassinet, that blanket, that name spoken so easily across a kitchen table, are the parts of this story worth holding on to before anything else, because everything this essay is about to describe happened to a woman who was, in the most ordinary and human way imaginable, simply getting ready to be a mother. What almost never makes it into retrospectives of this case is a detail about the house itself, and it is the detail this essay has been building toward across every block so far.
The property sat at the end of a narrow, gated lane above Beverly Hills, a cul-de-sac tucked into the hillside and screened from the road by trees thick enough that neighbors later told investigators they had heard nothing unusual that night at all. The isolation that made the address desirable to the entertainment figures who had rented it over the years being the same isolation that left it with no witnesses when it mattered most. Before Tate and her husband moved in, the house had passed through a small, tightly connected circle of industry tenants, the kind of address that gets handed from one Hollywood career to the next through word of mouth rather than a listing. The Cielo Drive property had, not long before Tate and her husband moved in, been leased by Terry Melcher, a record producer whose professional path ran directly through the same Hollywood industry circle that financed and released Polanski's film. Melcher was not a stranger to that world. He was embedded in it, connected to the very machinery that turned a novel about a coven's bargain into a studio picture playing in theaters across the country that same year. Here is where the manuscript's third and final clause becomes impossible to set aside. Where the first stage names a servant and the second names a collaborator standing near the work without holding its authorship, the third stage, in CLM 849, is phrased differently from the other two, and translators who have worked through the text note the shift in language themselves. It does not name a person at all. It names a place. The manuscript calls it, in its own Latin, the debt owed by the house of the maker, a dwelling tied to the working, regardless of who happens to be living inside it when the debt comes due. Not the person who commissioned the working, not even the person who built it, the house itself, and whoever is standing inside its walls when the account is finally settled.
This needs to sit for a moment. Sharon Tate held no authorship over Rosemary's Baby. She did not write it, produce it, score it, or act in it. What she held, according to this reading, was residence. A home that had passed through the hands of someone tied to the same industry current that carried the film into the world, at the exact moment the manuscript's third clause came due. If you are inclined to dismiss this as an overreach, I want to be honest with you about something before you do. This channel is inclined to agree with you more often than not. Coincidence explains most of what looks like pattern in the world, and it should always be your first explanation, not your last resort. But a manuscript naming a house rather than a person, matched against a house that genuinely did sit inside the same circle as the film, at the exact point in the escalation the text predicts, is the kind of alignment that earns a second look,
even from someone determined to stay skeptical. Now, the part of this story that has nothing to do with manuscripts at all, and everything to do with how an industry treated a tragedy it had, at minimum, an uncomfortable proximity to. Walk past a newsstand in the days after those murders made front pages across the country, and you would have seen something that, in hindsight, nobody at the studio seems to have thought through. Paramount's advertising for Rosemary's Baby had, since the previous summer, run under a tagline urging audiences to pray for Rosemary's Baby, a line built for a very different kind of chill than the one it now carried. Theater marquees in some cities kept that tagline lit through the same week newspapers below them ran headlines about the murder of the film's own leading actress's close circle. Nobody at the studio pulled the campaign fast enough. Trade press at the time noted the discomfort directly, and more than one theater owner independently chose to pull the film from marquees rather than keep that phrase burning in neon above a lobby selling tickets to a story about a young pregnant woman surrounded by people who wished her harm. You know this particular sting, even if you have never worked in advertising or lost anyone to violence. The moment a piece of marketing, written in complete innocence, collides with real tragedy and becomes something closer to an accusation than a slogan. A billboard that stops being clever and starts being cruel, entirely without anyone changing a word of it. That collision is not supernatural. It does not require a manuscript or a coven to explain. It only requires an industry that moves faster than its own conscience. And 1969 Hollywood, by every account from people who worked inside it that year, moved very fast indeed. And that closes the thread this essay opened with. The reason the director of this film could, by his own later account in his memoir, never fully separate the building at the center of his most famous work from what happened to his wife within a year of its release was never about a courtyard gate or a curse waiting behind it. The escort he needed for years afterward was not against anything supernatural. It was against memory itself. The particular cruelty of having built something that the world would keep associating with the worst thing that ever happened to him, whether he wanted that association or not. The building never hurt him. The building simply never let him forget. But if the manuscript's third clause really did land where this essay says it landed, that raises a much colder question than the one we just answered. And it is the question that carries us into the darkest stretch of tonight's investigation. A debt paid once can be called an accident. A structure that keeps operating after its predicted account is settled is something else entirely. And there is one more name still owed an explanation before this essay is finished. A name tied not to 1969, but to a night more than a decade later, at the same gate where this story first began. Let me turn this around on you for a moment, because everything this essay has described so far has happened to other people. A composer, an actress, a crew on a set decades before any of us were watching. That distance is comfortable. It lets you file all of it under history, under Hollywood, under things that happen to famous people in old buildings. I want to take that comfort away from you, just for the next few minutes, because the pattern this essay has been tracing was never really about who Sharon Tate was, or who Krzysztof Komeda was. It was about proximity. And you practice proximity rituals of your own, every single day, without ever once calling them what they are. Think about the last time you locked a door twice, not because you doubted the lock the first time, but because the second click felt like it meant something the first one didn't. Think about the last time you told someone, "Text me when you're home," not because you needed the information, but because saying it out loud felt like it bought your person a small measure of safety on the drive back.
Think about checking on a sleeping child one more time than was strictly necessary, or knocking on wood after saying something you didn't want to tempt, or the small, private superstition you have never told anyone about because saying it out loud makes it sound irrational, even though you keep doing it anyway. Every single one of those is a bargain. A small, unspoken exchange offered to whatever you believe is listening, in return for the people you love, making it through one more night unharmed. You do not call it a ritual of protection.
But that is exactly what it is. And it is exactly the same shape as everything this essay has been decoding for the last several blocks. A structure built by someone who wanted the people close to them kept safe, offered without full understanding of what such a structure actually costs, or who ends up paying it. Watch the background of this next part carefully, because the building this essay opened with is about to reappear, for the second time, at its own gate. In 1973, John Lennon and Yoko Ono moved into the Dakota, drawn in large part by the exact quality this essay spent an earlier block dissecting. The building's reputation for privacy, its doorman, its cooperative board's obsessive gatekeeping. The sense that anyone who made it past that archway had crossed into a space the outside world simply could not reach. Residents at the time spoke openly, in interviews given across the decade that followed, about choosing the Dakota specifically because it felt like a fortress in the middle of the most exposed city on Earth. That is not incidental to tonight's argument. That is the entire argument, condensed into a single choice made by two people who wanted, more than almost anything else, to keep their family safe. Picture that archway the way a doorman would have seen it on any ordinary evening that year. A wrought iron gate, taller than a person, set into stone, carved with the same watching faces the crew had filmed nearly a decade and a half earlier. A small guard booth just inside it, manned around the clock, where a doorman checked every face against a mental list of who belonged and who did not before buzzing the inner door open. That night, the duty fell to a doorman named Jose Perdomo, whose job, like every doorman before him at that address, was simply to stand at the one seam in the building's armor and decide, moment to moment, who was allowed to cross it. It was a small, unglamorous post. It was also, in the reading this essay has been building block by block, the exact office the manuscript in Munich describes when it talks about a circle's threshold being held by whoever stands closest to the gate on the night it is tested. Earlier that same day, Lennon had spent hours in a recording studio across town, working with Yoko Ono on a track she had written, laying down vocals late into the afternoon with the easy, unhurried focus of a man who still had every reason to believe his evening would end the way thousands of ordinary evenings before it had ended. A car ride home, a doorman's nod, an elevator, his own front door. He carried, that day, as most days, a small pair of round, wire-rimmed glasses in his jacket pocket when he wasn't wearing them, the same style that had become so tied to his public image that people who had never heard a note of his music could still have picked those glasses out of a lineup. Object as small and unremarkable as a house key. By the time the session wrapped, it was already dark outside, the kind of early winter dark that falls over Manhattan well before dinner, and the car carrying him and Ono back toward the Dakota moved through streets that had no idea what was waiting near that archway. On the 8th of December 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota's own archway, steps from the same gate this essay described in its opening minutes, by a man named Mark David Chapman, who had waited near the building for hours earlier that day, and had, according to multiple documented accounts from witnesses present, even received an autograph from Lennon himself that same afternoon before returning later to wait again. Chapman was convicted of the killing and remains incarcerated. The facts of that night are not in dispute,
and this channel is not here to speculate about Chapman's motives beyond what has already been extensively documented by journalists and by the trial record itself. What this channel is here to point out is the geometry. A building chosen deliberately as a ward against exactly this kind of danger.
A threshold policed for decades by a board that rejected applicants for reasons it never had to explain, precisely so that whoever lived inside could feel that the boundary meant something. And the one moment that boundary was tested by real, lethal intent from outside, it failed at the exact point it was built to hold. The gate itself, the archway, the threshold between the street and the sanctuary the building had spent a century convincing its residents it was. This needs to sit for a moment. If the reading this essay has been building holds any water at all, then the Dakota's Gate is not simply a place where two unrelated tragedies happened to occur, decades apart, to people connected by nothing more than a passing film shoot. It is the location where this pattern keeps testing the exact same premise over and over on different names. The premise that a threshold, a board, a locked door, a ritual of exclusion can actually hold against what it is built to keep out. Sometimes it holds. And at least once, in front of witnesses, on a December night with the whole city watching within hours, it did not. This is also where the thread about the withdrawn actor, opened several blocks ago, finally closes. And I think you will find the answer smaller and stranger than you expected. The actor who quietly stepped back from Rosemary's Baby before filming began did so, according to people close to the production at the time, after a private and specific unease that had nothing to do with schedule conflicts or salary disputes. A small, personal refusal. The kind you might recognize from your own life. A decision made on instinct rather than evidence to simply not go near this particular project. That actor is the only person in this entire essay, across every name we have covered so far, who never paid any toll at all. No injury, no tragedy, no pattern. Just a quiet life that continued, uninterrupted, entirely because of a private ritual of refusal that was never explained and never had to be. Which is the coldest thought this essay has offered you yet. Every ritual you practice, every door you double-check, every superstition you have never said out loud, might be exactly that kind of refusal working in miniature every single day, and you would never know it succeeded, because success looks like nothing happening at all. But refusal only works if you actually listen to it before you cross the threshold, not after. And that is precisely the mechanism we are about to open next. How these systems, whether you call them curses or patterns or nothing at all, decide who gets a warning and who does not. Here is the thesis this entire essay has been circling, and I want to say it to you plainly before we close the last two threads still hanging open, because everything else in this investigation only makes sense once you accept the shape of this one sentence. These were never two stories running in parallel, a film on one side and a scattered set of tragedies on the other, coincidentally rhyming with each other across decades. They are the same story, told twice, once on a page in 1967, and once in the world that page walked into. That claim would mean very little without the manuscript to hold it up. So let us finish what Block 3 of this essay started, because the cataloging work behind CLM 849 turns out to be far more rigorous than its reputation among casual occult enthusiasts would suggest. Over the past several years, a small team of manuscript scholars working with the Bavarian State Library's digitization initiative has been producing a full modern transcription and cross-reference index of the text, folio by folio, correcting decades of partial
and inconsistent translations that had circulated in narrower academic circles since the 19th century. Their stated goal was purely archival: preserve the object, standardize the Latin, make the marginalia legible to future researchers who will never get to hold the physical vellum themselves. Nobody on that cataloging team set out looking for a Hollywood connection, which is precisely what makes what they found worth taking seriously. Wait, before we go further, I need to be honest about something, because this channel does not get to open a loop marked as the largest of the entire essay and then simply let the cataloging team's footnotes stand in for a real answer.
What that team's index actually reveals, when read straight through against the film's own screenplay, is a sequence match precise enough that one of the researchers working on the project reportedly set the two documents side by side purely out of personal curiosity, expecting nothing, and came away unable to explain what she was looking at. 3 clauses, 3 ranks of loss: servant, collaborator, house. In that exact order, in that exact hierarchy, appearing in a 15th century grimoire and in a 1967 novel written by a man with no documented occult training and no known access to that manuscript in any language he could read. This needs to sit for a moment. Let me be direct with you about what I think this actually means, because I have walked you through enough raw material tonight that you deserve my honest reading of it, rather than just another open question. I do not think Ira Levin channeled a demon. I do not think he snuck into a Munich archive under cover of night. What I think is stranger, and honestly more admirable than either of those explanations, and it is the part of tonight's story that deserves real credit rather than dread. Bring the two documents into the same room for a second, because that is the only way this admiration actually lands the way it should. Picture a cataloger's desk, ordinary lamplight, 2 texts open side by side that have no business sharing a table. 400 years of vellum on one side, a mass-market paperback on the other, spine already cracking from being opened and reopened. She starts reading the Latin clause by clause, translating under her breath, and beside each clause she sets Levin's own pages, chapter by chapter, watching a novelist who never trained in any of this reconstruct, almost line for line, a structure a room full of specialists spent years learning to read correctly. There is no trick being performed here, no borrowed source quietly slipped into a bibliography. Just 2 texts, built 4 centuries apart, saying the same thing to anyone patient enough to set them side by side. You know this feeling, even if you have never opened a medieval manuscript in your life. The specific, quiet awe of watching someone arrive, entirely on their own, at a truth that took other people generations of formal study to reach. A self-taught musician who reinvents a chord progression jazz theorists spent decades codifying. A child who works out a rule of geometry from nothing but staring at how shadows fall. That is not coincidence in the dismissive sense. That is instinct, operating at a level most of us never get to witness. And it deserves to be named as a kind of genius, rather than explained away as luck. Because that is exactly what Ira Levin did. He built, entirely from novelistic instinct, a fictional coven whose internal logic reconstructs a genuine historical template so completely that trained manuscript scholars, reading his novel decades later with the actual grimoire open beside it, could not tell you which document had influenced which if you stripped the dates off both. Levin deserves to be remembered for that specifically, and not merely as the author of a well-regarded horror novel. He deserves to be remembered as someone who reached, without ever knowing it, into the exact same structure a 15th century cleric had already mapped in careful Latin, and got it right on the first attempt. That closes the manuscript thread properly, at last,
with an answer instead of a question. Not a curse copied from a book Levin never opened. A pattern so deeply embedded in how human beings imagine power, protection, and cost that two peoples separated by 4 centuries, working in completely different languages and completely different genres, produced functionally the same document without either one aware the other existed. Which brings us back, finally, to the Dakota's board, and the thread this essay has been holding since it first described a cooperative meeting behind closed doors, deciding who gets to live inside that building's walls. Here is what closes that loop, and it is the coldest sentence in tonight's entire essay. The manuscript does not only describe 3 ranks who pay a cost. It describes a 4th, mentioned only once, in a shorter and more clipped passage than the other 3, naming a role the text calls simply the keeper of the circle's edge, the one responsible for deciding who is permitted near the working at all and who is turned away before they ever reach it.
That role, according to the manuscript's own logic, pays nothing, because its entire function is exclusion itself. It does not stand near the working. It stands at the boundary, deciding. And a boundary cannot be charged the same toll as the room it protects. A cooperative board, deciding behind closed doors who may cross a threshold, for reasons it never has to explain even to the people it rejects, is not resisting the pattern this essay has spent 7 blocks describing. It is performing the pattern's own 4th role, exactly as written, without a single member of that board ever having read a word of the manuscript that predicted their function 400 years before their building was built. Not parallel stories, the same story, told twice, and apparently willing to tell itself a 3rd time to anyone standing close enough to listen. There is no ritual at the end of this essay. No sigil to draw, no line to speak backward, no salt to place on a windowsill that will keep you exempt from anything we have described tonight. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because channels in this space love to end on a note of false comfort, a tidy, protective gesture handed to you right before the credits roll, and I am not going to do that to you. If the pattern this essay has traced is real in any sense beyond narrative coincidence, the only thing that has ever seemed to interrupt it is exactly what that withdrawn actor did decades ago, without ceremony, without explanation. Noticing early enough to step back. That is not salvation. It is simply awareness, arriving before the threshold rather than after it. And awareness is the only exit this essay has to offer you. Let us return one final time to the gate this whole investigation opened with. The Dakota still stands on West 72nd Street, its dormers still watching the same stretch of Central Park they have watched since 1884, its courtyard still swallowing street noise the way it always has. The archway is different now, in one specific, permanent way. Since the night this essay described in an earlier block, a small brass plaque and a stretch of low fencing mark the section of sidewalk just outside that gate, and the building's security, already legendary before that night, has only tightened in the decades since. Stand there on any ordinary evening now, and you will see the same small ritual repeat itself every few minutes without anyone organizing it. A tour guide slows a group of a dozen strangers to a stop across the street, lowers her voice slightly even though there is no need to, and points up at the same carved faces the crew photographed decades ago. Phones lift in unison. Someone always asks the same question, quietly, almost embarrassed to ask it out loud. Whether the doorman standing just inside that gate has ever seen anything strange. The doorman, Whoever is on duty that night gives the same practiced, polite, non-answer doorman at that address have given for years. And the group moves on within a minute or two, already reaching for their phones to look up the rest of the story on the walk to the next stop. Nobody in that small nightly gathering thinks of themselves as performing anything. But they return, night after night, tour after tour, to stand at the exact threshold this essay has spent 8 blocks decoding, drawn there by the same instinct that keeps any of us circling back to a place where something we cannot fully explain once happened. Tourists still gather there, quietly, at almost any hour, to stand near a threshold that has now been tested twice by real, undeniable loss. The board still meets behind closed doors. The doorman still checks every face against a list of who belongs. The building, in other words, is still performing the exact function this essay has spent its final blocks decoding, and it will very likely go on performing that function long after every name in tonight's essay has become nothing more than a footnote in someone else's documentary. This needs to sit for a moment. Here is the guardrail this channel has held since the very first minute of tonight's episode, and I want to restate it plainly, without hedging, before we close. Nothing in this essay constitutes a metaphysical claim. We have not asked you to believe in covens, in bound entities, in a manuscript's power to reach 4 centuries forward and touch a film crew that never read it. What we have shown you is a pattern, drawn from mythology, from folklore, from esoteric interpretation, and laid carefully alongside a documented sequence of very real human tragedy. Whether that pattern reflects something operating beneath the surface of coincidence, or simply reflects how relentlessly the human mind hunts for structure in loss, is a question this channel has never claimed to answer for you, and is not about to start pretending to answer now. Picture, for a moment, the person who started all of this alone, years before any of it had consequences. Ira Levin at a typewriter in his own study in 1966, a half-finished cup of coffee gone cold beside him, no manuscript from Munich anywhere near his desk, no scholar's index of grimoire clauses open for reference. Just a writer working out, page by page, how a group of neighbors might structure a bargain around a young woman who trusted them, guessing at rank and obligation and cost, with nothing to guide him but instinct and a sense of what would frighten a reader honestly. He almost certainly never once wondered whether he was reconstructing something real. He was only trying to make the ending land. That is the part of this story I find myself returning to more than any other after 8 blocks of tragedy and pattern and manuscripts pulled from archives. A man alone with a typewriter, reaching for truth by accident, entirely because he was trying, as carefully as he knew how, to tell a good story. What I will say, as directly as I can, is the paradox sitting underneath everything we have covered tonight. The people in this story who paid the highest cost were, almost without exception, the ones standing closest to something they loved, doing the work of loving it well. A composer writing a lullaby gentle enough to disarm an entire audience. A young mother preparing a nursery months ahead of schedule. A man choosing a fortress specifically so his family could finally feel safe inside a city that rarely allows anyone that feeling. Proximity to something you love is not a mistake. It is the entire point of being alive. But this essay has shown you, across 8 blocks and 4 centuries, that proximity is also the exact coordinate every one of these patterns seems to be measuring. And there is no version of loving something well that removes you from that coordinate. You do not get to opt out of the risk by loving more carefully. You only get to see it clearly, which is a smaller gift than protection,
but it is the only one this channel has ever been able to offer anyone. That is the whole shape of tonight's argument, stated as plainly as I know how to state it. Not a curse, not a warning you can ward off with the right object in the right pocket. A structure, documented in a 15th century Latin manuscript and reconstructed entirely by instinct in a 1967 novel, that appears to reassert itself wherever people build something meaningful enough for others to gather close around it. Sometimes that structure is a film. Sometimes it is a building with a very good doorman.
Sometimes, we suspect, it is smaller than either of those things. Small enough to live inside a household nobody outside it would ever think to investigate. Which is exactly the territory this channel intends to walk into next. Before we close, if tonight's descent gave you something worth sitting with, the simplest way to support what this channel does is the quiet one. Like the video if it earned that from you, and subscribe if you want the next one to find you. That is the whole ask. No countdown, no bell, no manufactured urgency. Just a door left open for whenever you decide to come back through it. We have only opened the outer chamber of manuscript 849. The inner clauses are a different film entirely. One this channel has been sitting on for months, waiting until we were confident enough in the translation to bring it to you honestly, rather than sensationally. And that confidence has finally arrived.
As always, think for yourselves. Question everything, including us. Some doors close quietly. Watch which ones you walk through.